Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Good evening. Japan has delivered a stark warning to the UK about the impact of Brexit on its businesses. In a document obtained by Sky News, it threatens to pull some of its major companies from the UK and move them to mainland Europe if they're negatively affected by the decision to leave the EU. Japanese car companies are worried about a double whammy of trade tariffs on import of parts and exports of UK-assembled products. Banks say they could relocate to continental Europe if they're unable to operate in the EU from London. And Japanese pharmaceutical companies could also quit the UK if the EU's medicines agency leaves the capital. Speaking at a G20 meeting of world leaders in China, the Prime Minister said that Brexit wouldn't be plain sailing, but insisted that Britain would make a success of it.
The UK has always been a strong partner for the US, and that will remain the case. We have a thriving economic relationship. British businesses export twice as much to the United States as they do to our next largest market, and the United States is the largest inward investor in Britain, with total American investments providing more than 1 million jobs. We need to build on that strong foundation as the UK leaves the EU. We're both strong supporters of free trade. And today we've discussed how to take forward consultations to ensure that the UK and US have the strongest possible trading relationship. And this reinforces my belief that as we forge a new global role for the UK, we can and will seize the opportunities that Brexit presents and make a success of it.
Well, our political editor Faisal Islam is at the summit in Hangzhou in China.
Three big challenges for Theresa May arriving here at the G20 summit: to introduce herself to other world leaders, and she was a figure of some intrigue, world leaders making a beeline to her, to try and scope out this new addition to the world leaders stage, but also at this intriguing time for Britain's place in the world post-Brexit. She also had to explain what Britain's place will be in the world and persuade those other world leaders that Britain wants to be what she calls a beacon of free trade, that they should not see the Brexit vote as Britain turning away from the world and being an open economy and being a trading economy. She sees it as the embodiment of that when she says Brexit means Brexit. In order to do that, though, she needs, in the medium term, trade deals with big partners in the Pacific. First thing, though, Japan issued an extraordinary and uncharacteristic piece of public diplomacy, a 15-page letter, a message to the United Kingdom and the European Union, unearthed by Sky News. And what it is a list of Japanese business, a wish list, if you like, of their concerns about their investments and trade with the United Kingdom. It stretches all sorts of industries, from the car industry, where they have a concern about a double whammy of tariffs faced by car manufacturers. Remember, big names like Honda, Nissan, Toyota are Japanese and have big investments in the UK. But there was also specific reference to Japanese banks in the city and their access to what's known as the financial services passport. Direct reference in this letter to the notion that some Japanese banks might move their European corporate HQs to the continent if Brexit goes through and we leave the single market. But not just that, also Japanese pharma companies wanting to make sure that the EU's medical agency remains in London. That sounds like pie in the sky. Why would the EU leave their medical agency in a country that's no longer in the EU? So a host of challenges there from Japan in an extraordinary piece of public diplomacy, but also from the US, where you may have expected perhaps President Obama to row back a little bit from that very strong intervention ahead of the EU referendum, saying back of the queue. He made the same analysis. He said that America would be first and foremost interested in striking big cross-continental trade deals before Britain would be given a chance. Maybe that's going to change after the US presidentials, but for the minute, Britain's strategy of trying to attract attention from the world leaders here has only been reciprocated by Australia. We need more of these types of deals to come forward. for Theresa May to succeed in what she says, Brexit meaning Brexit, she's going to make a success of it. That's her aim. She needs more help from other world leaders if that's to become the reality.
So what would an economic withdrawal from Britain look like, and how damaging would it be? Our North East correspondent Gerard Tubb has more.
If Brexit means Brexit, then Japanese businesses will not be happy. Nissan employs more than 6,000 people in Sunderland to make almost 500,000 cars. Half of them are exported to Europe. Like other big Japanese firms, it's here because the UK is its gateway to European markets. Pro-EU politicians in the North East are not surprised that Japan wants to keep that gateway open.
It's now, I think, vital that the government kick away from the sound bites of Brexit means Brexit and explain exactly what our relationship is going to be with the EU.
And if the question is, what have the Japanese done for us? Cars is not the only answer. Hitachi brought its worldwide rail HQ to London and built a train factory in the northeast. Pharmaceutical and banking firms have invested heavily. In all, more than 1,000 Japanese firms operate in Britain, employing 140,000 people, with total investments of £38 billion. Hardly surprising then that ahead of the referendum, Japan's Prime Minister lobbied for Britain to stay in the EU. His government's wish list at the G20 summit is seen as more of the same.
I think it's absolutely understandable that the Japanese government would want to set their concerns out in these terms. They have a major stake in the future of the United Kingdom because they have chosen the United Kingdom as the centre for nearly half the investment that comes from Japan that goes into the European Union.
Keeping the wheels on the bus, or in this case the car, is clearly in Japan's interests. The question for both sides in the Brexit divide is whether what's best for Japan is necessarily best for the UK. Gerard Tubb, Sky News.
Well, let's get more on our top story as Japan pulled no punches with a warning in a 15-page report that companies may leave the UK if Brexit negotiations are unsatisfactory. We can speak now to Sir David Warren, a former British ambassador to Japan. He's in our Westminster studio. Many thanks for joining us this afternoon on Sky News. How concerned should we be in light of the release of this document?
Well, the Japanese government and Japanese companies are making clear in this document their concerns about the Brexit negotiations. They have a major stake in the sort of country that we want to be and in the way in which our economy is going to relate to that of Europe over the coming years. There are over 1,000 Japanese companies in the UK and they create something like 140,000 jobs. So they have a direct interest in this, and this document, which is a very detailed sector-by-sector analysis of their concerns, is setting out what they want to see emerge from these negotiations in terms of tariff-free access for goods, harmonised regulations, access to skills, and so forth. And it's a document which is aimed at the EU as well as at the UK. What the Japanese government are saying here is there is going to be a negotiation. We want to see that the terms of this negotiation are terms which reflect the interests of Britain's and Europe's economic partners, and that what comes out of the negotiation does not impede the business plans of Japanese companies investing in the UK.
So, Sir David, is this a reaffirmation once again of how necessary it is that Britain does establish a trade deal that will benefit all parties?
It's absolute confirmation of the importance of Britain remaining part of the single market. At the heart of this document is the Japanese government's concern that the negotiations on Brexit should not damage the business environment. Indeed, the document says explicitly we would like to see the current business environment maintained as far as possible. I think the Japanese recognise that as we leave the EU, it's not going to be possible to maintain it totally. But they don't want the terms of the divorce to damage Japanese companies' interests. And that means access for goods, and it also means access for services. So the document is a very detailed, granular analysis of what each sector, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, electronics, IT, really want to come out of these talks. and it emphasises the importance of maintaining free trade. Indeed, at the top of the document, there's a statement that the Japanese government want the British government to join them in maintaining the importance of global free trade. They're saying this at a time when the principles of free trade are very much under threat, particularly in the United States, with the arguments in the presidential election there. So I think that the Japanese will be very reassured by Prime Minister Theresa May's commitment to free trade, which she's made at the G20.
And on the point of free trade, the Prime Minister's message going into the G20 summit was that Britain was open for business, Britain was ready to trade. Do you think that will be enough to allay the fears of the other countries who are involved in the G20 summits, not just Japan?
Well, it's important, I believe, that we should maintain that principle of free trade. But the Japanese document should remind us that this is not simply about the rhetoric of free trade. It's about being in the room and influential as the details of trade and investment arrangements are fixed. It means being there as regulations are harmonized. It means having access to a free market in goods and services. And the 15-page annex to the document goes through tremendous detail on the individual requirements of individual sectors. And these are all very different and require very detailed negotiations. So this isn't simply something about making a general statement of how important global free trade is. It's important to set out those principles, but it's also important to recognize that those thousands of Japanese and other companies that have invested in the UK because we were part of the single market and because being here gave them access to that single market, they are looking nervously at the negotiations for Brexit to ensure that they're not damaged by the result of these talks.
And so David, you said yourself we're going to need some really detailed negotiations. I mean, how difficult is that going to be to achieve, given the fact that there are so many different angles that the Prime Minister and the negotiators are going to be having to look at in the run-up to Article 50 being invoked?
Well, it will be complicated, but this is what I'm sure the government understand, and this is the way in which they will be approaching this problem. The important thing is that we get to a position where we are able to tell our friends and partners like Japan what the basic principles of these negotiations are going to be. And so far, what we've seen from the discussion in Cabinet last week at Chequers and from some of the commentary in the press is that there is a fundamental argument going on within the government about whether the emphasis should be on freedom of movement, maintaining access to the single market, which means tolerating a high level of freedom of movement of labour, or whether we should be putting the emphasis in a different direction and accepting that we can't have access to the single market because it's important for us to protect our borders against high levels of immigration. Now, that argument needs to be resolved before the negotiations can get underway. And the Japanese government's document is saying to us, this makes us nervous because it creates uncertainty. We want to see transparency in the negotiations. We want to see clarity as the principles of the negotiations are developed and articulated, and we don't want any unpleasant surprises in the final stages which we have not been in a position to influence. This is a document which sets out concerns, I think, very carefully and offers to be part of a process which helps us get this right. The Japanese government make explicitly clear that they respect the decision that has been taken to move towards Brexit, but they say we have a direct interest in this because it affects us, it affects our companies, it affects our economy. And therefore we want to be part of a process of dialogue that enables us to be a constructive influence in this difficult exercise.
Okay, so David Warren, many thanks indeed for your insights. So David Warren, former British ambassador to Japan.